Welcome to the Feisworld podcast, engaging conversations that cross the boundaries between business, art, and the digital world.
For the first time on a surfboard, and that kind of divided my life into two moments, before and after surfing, and kind of been the driving force of everything that I do. I mean, I've surfed for the better part of 7 years now. I don't know that I've ever done anything that long. Can you think of any other sport where you get your social, physical, and spiritual needs all met in one activity? It's like going to a bar, church, and a gym all in one day. And the thing is that, people have this idea that creative people have these really, insanely interesting lives, and that they're, living, in a constant state of chaos. But that's not really true. I mean, I think the most productive creative people are the ones who are driven entirely by habit. Like their days are very predictable. And to me, that I try not to do anything that will throw off that routine.
Hi everyone, you are listening to the Feisworld podcast. This is your host, Fei Wu. I want to take a moment and thank all my guests who have appeared on my show, listeners who have been so helpful in making Feisworld better every day. We're just short of 10,000 downloads, a number I would have never imagined if you asked me a year ago. But 10,000 really isn't all that many or impressive compared to top podcasts. However, one of my favorite metaphors is that imagine how many people it takes to fill an auditorium, usually less than 10,000 people, and imagine that you can speak to all of them multiple times. I have a very special guest today, someone I have admired from afar as a listener, so please join me in welcoming Srini Rao from the Unmistakable Creative to the Feisworld podcast. Srini is the host and founder of the Unmistakable Creative, where he has conducted over 600 interviews with thought leaders and people from all walks of life. Srini has a distinctive view into branding, storytelling, and marketing. As a result, I have followed Unmistakable Creative for over a year, never missed a single episode. Unmistakable Creative isn't your typical interview podcast. You never hear from the same people, topics, and guests invited to Srini's show all have very interesting lives, insights, and unique point of views. To add to that, Srini asks questions that have never been asked before. He won't let them off the hook easy and expects no easy answers. Interviewing Srini, on the other hand, was not an easy task because he expects the same from an interviewer like me. Instead of focusing on Srini's achievements, putting Unmistakable Creative on a pedestal, I took a different approach and asked him about his daily practice. The purpose is simple. I hope you take away as much as you can today, not tomorrow, and to start practicing what Srini has shared with us on this podcast. It would be great if you could say hi to Srini on Twitter at Unmistakable CEO and tell him what you have learned and how perhaps it has impacted your life already. I also think the theme of Feisworld, and in particular of today's podcast, is that creativity is rooted in insatiable curiosity. So next time you run into someone who's interesting, make sure you ask them a few questions. Without further ado, please welcome Srini Rao from the Unmistakable Creative. Thank you so much for joining Feisworld. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to help.
I am, as a result of this podcast, I was able to learn so much more about you, your writing. I am in particular extremely excited about the shorts, the animated shorts that you've been producing as well.
Cool. I'm really glad to hear you like them.
Yeah, they're fantastic. And I think for most of my listeners, first of all, I feel like I'm surprised when I talk to people that I haven't heard of Unmistakable Creative, so which makes me feel like it's a hidden gem, and it's such a fantastic resource that it's a shame that not more people have taken advantage of it. But personally, as a result of listening to it for the past year or so, I have been posting a lot, I've been following you, and as a result, a lot of my friends have subscribed, and they've all given me just phenomenal feedback on the conversations you've had. So
nice. Well, I'm really happy to hear that.
Oh, I know how, as a podcaster, I feel like, for you, how many years has it been? I couldn't get an accurate read of the number of years you've been running Unmistakable Creative
Yeah.
podcast.
As a brand, Unmistakable is only 2 years old, but as a we started as a podcast for bloggers called Blogcast FM about 6 years ago, I think in 2010. So it'll be 6 years after this year.
Fantastic. And you've had thought leaders so far over 500 interviews recorded from people from like all walks of life, including Seth Godin's an obvious one. And then this morning on my way to work, I saw a new approach of like best of 2015, and I thought,
Right.
oh, that was so phenomenal. And it's a great way to kind of rebroadcast some of the I guess the favorites and the best of. So I spent a lot of time learning about you, Srini, and I must say I am a surfer wannabe, and I've spent I'm originally from Beijing, and sorry, I haven't even introduced myself yet, but I'll get into that after I ask this question. But one of the most surprising thing I found out about you is surfing. And then I realized the moment that we're triggered, and I see more and more of that themes in your writing, in your conversations with your guests. Could you tell me a little more about how you got into that?
Yeah, I actually was doing a study abroad in Brazil, while I was in graduate school, and I went to graduate school coincidentally near the beach in Pepperdine, Malibu, of all places. But it took leaving California and leaving Malibu for some reason to take to surfing. We were spending so much time in the water that inevitably I just kind of finally got in. And 2 days before I came home, I stood up for the first time on a surfboard, and that kind of divided my life into 2 moments before and after surfing, and or into 2 parts really. And it's kind of been the driving force of everything that I do. I mean, I've surfed for the better part of 7 years now. I don't know that I've ever done anything that long, but.
Wow.
But it's been one of those things that's it's a spiritual practice, it's exercise. I jokingly say, I'm like, can you think of any other sport where you get your social, physical, and spiritual needs all met in one activity? It's like going to a bar, church, and a gym all in one day.
I love that metaphor. It's awesome. Wow.
Yeah, that's how it started, and it's kind of been integral to everything that I do.
Is this something that you do on a daily basis?
I try to. It's not always daily, but it's pretty frequent, several times a week.
What about this morning?
Not this morning. I've been writing because I have a deadline for my publisher, which we can talk a little bit about that as well if you want. But yeah, I'm working on that right now, so that's kind of my big priority.
I read about that. I believe it's a new book that you're writing, and I would love to hear more about that. Is there a release date? Is there a title that's been determined?
There is a title that's been determined, and there is a release date. The title is Unmistakable: Why Only is Better Than Best, and then the release date is August of 2016.
Wow. And on average, I'm so fascinated by like the making of process. I interview a lot of authors on my podcast, and I try to do kind of a cross check. I'm also friends with James Altucher, and we and Claudia. We spend a lot of time talking about writing. And you, are a, Wall Street Journal bestseller of The Art of Being Unmistakable. I love that title because when I was, I think you might find this interesting, when I was interviewed at the agency I work for called Arno Worldwide by a researcher about, how, Faye, do you consider yourself creative outside of work? Because I'm a digital producer here. And I said, of course. And she said, what kind of creative do you consider yourself to be? And I said, Unmistakable Creative. And I said, you should also check out the podcast.
Awesome.
So actually tell us a little more about the new book, because I'm really fascinated by your writing, and I feel extremely uplifted every time I read your book, including the one I mentioned. And last night I found the PDF version of The Compass, and I'm so eager to I started printing it at home, and it was 80 pages, and I feel like, I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you via email, but I think it's going to be a great 2016 calendar for most people to print it out and then just stick a piece of paper where they work, whether, at a job or at a home, and it will be a great compass for life.
Interesting. I never thought of it that way, but yeah. So what is the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. The previous question I asked is, could you maybe tell us a little more about the book you're working on? Is there a different approach? Is there a new
Yeah,
storyline?
it's very different. I mean, The Art of Being Unmistakable, I think, was really just a series of observations and, thoughts. I don't know that you could really technically call it a book. It was just kind of thrown together. I mean, we edited it, obviously, and it did very well unexpectedly, kind of exceeded all the expectations I had. But this is really kind of a real book with a publisher. It has a real structure. I think that's one thing that that book didn't really have. So, the idea behind it is to kind of create a framework or compass, really, for this entire process of how do you, figure out what it is that makes you unmistakable. And, we're, going through case studies, going through examples and, observations, my own story. So it's been a pretty grueling, long process of creating it. Every day, you're working on it, and it's 50,000 words, and it all has to tie together. And you've got editors who are scrutinizing every detail. So it's not the same as it's very different than self-publishing. But I think that the thing that I realized is that getting to do a book with a publisher is really, there's a lot that can be said for getting to choose yourself and getting your work out into the world. But I don't think we've gotten to that point yet in publishing where a self-published book has the same sort of credibility layer as a traditionally published book. Like, we're getting close, but we're not there. And that's one of the big reasons to do it, is because it really does, lend a sort of layer of credibility to your career, especially if you want to be a speaker or do any of that kind of stuff. So, but that's in a nutshell what the book is about.
Interesting. And this is one of the debates that I hear very often after interviewing authors. What are some of the, marketing vehicles or the benefits of working with a publisher that you have experienced so far?
Well, so I don't think the marketing vehicles really are the major benefit. I mean, they come to you because you have a platform and you've demonstrated that you can build an audience and you've got an audience that they can sell books to. But I think the bigger part of it is just the caliber and the quality of the work is held to a whole other standard. And the thing is, you have resources and people like an editor, like a writing coach, like people who design book covers to do layout and all that stuff. The things that I don't think we've quite gotten. We could do it with vanity publishing, but I don't think we're quite there yet. We still haven't gotten to those points. And of course, then distribution is another one. Getting you into bookstores and stuff like that. Like, you don't find self-published books in bookstores. Like, you couldn't buy The Art of Being Unmistakable at Barnes and Noble if you went there. So those are kinds of the small things. But I think the bigger thing really is it's a credibility thing. As much as we rave about self-publishing, and I'm a huge fan of self-publishing because that's how it started for me. I realized, okay, I'm not going to sit here and wait for somebody to come along. In fact, it's because I self-published that I ended up getting a book deal with a publisher. So there are pros and cons, but I think that, you really, if you're sitting around waiting, you're better off putting something out into the world and learning and iterating on that.
I like that approach. It's something that I want to also work on in 2016, and I think I might consider the route of considering self-publishing, put it on Amazon for 99 cents, and if it's going somewhere, and if Feisworld podcast is growing, maybe a publisher will come to me. So fingers crossed, that may be the path I can take on as well. There's a lot I want to talk about because knowing that you spent a lot of time working on your book today and in the next, I guess, foreseeable future for a number of months. And then in your email yesterday, I noticed that you said that you don't check your email for the first 3 to 4 hours in the morning.
That's correct.
Why is that?
I'm incredibly driven by habit. My first few hours of the day are the most critical. That's when I'm the most productive and most creative. So I make sure that I guard that time religiously. Like, you notice it's 10 o'clock in the morning. I don't allow any distractions to come into my world before 10 a.m. It's just mainly from a productivity point. And, the thing is, it's easy. We convince ourselves that we need to check email when we really don't. Most of the time, you could get away with checking email 1 or 2 times a day. Like, most of us are not, diffusing nuclear bombs or, managing World War III. So I think that the idea, your inbox gives you a false sense of productivity. That's really what it boils down to.
Totally agree. One of the reasons I'm super excited to chat with you today, Srini, is because I have taken a leap that I've never done in my life, is after working for 10 years, really build kind of a client base, whether it's professionally at work and also leveraging my skills outside of work. I have put in my notice very recently this week to say that I think I'm ready. And this is all in between of researching you, reading The Art of Being Unmistakable. And don't worry, I'm not blaming you for quitting my job. So I am perfectly ready, sort of mentally, financially ready to take on something new on my own. And it's like the lifestyle when you wrote about, at the beginning of the book, when you wrote about, really planning things around surfing and people and things that make you happy. And I am completely supportive of that. And then I began to really see myself in it. And you write even more about, courage and confidence, which we'll get into later. But I am really curious about how, is there a typical day for you? And how do you usually spend your day? Like, when do you get up and when do you go, where do you go surfing? And what do you do for the rest of the day?
Yeah, so I mean, my typical days are very much sort of, today actually is a good example of a typical day, minus the surfing part. I'm up by 6 a.m. most days. I spend the first hour reading a book, and then I write by hand for about a half hour, 45 minutes. I try not to turn on any devices for the first hour of the day because I find that it's actually really quiet. I also meditate for about 10 minutes. That's the habit that I picked up in the last probably 60 to 90 days, just based on things I'd heard from people on Unmistakable Creative. I was like, okay, you know what? I think it's time to embrace this habit. Clearly, it has some interesting benefits. So that's and then of course on days that are I'll surf, and then from anywhere from 10 to 2 p.m. usually is when I'm doing interviews for the podcast. By afternoon, usually I'm pretty shot. Like I try not to schedule too much stuff then, and that's when I read books and catch up on things, and try to catch up on email and review numbers and basically do anything administrative. So that's really kind of the way. And the thing is that people have this idea that creative people have these really insanely interesting lives and that they're living in a constant state of chaos, but that's not really true. I mean, I think the most productive creative people are the ones who are driven entirely by habit. Like their days are very predictable, and to me that I try not to do anything that will throw off that routine.
I'm also very interested in what are some of the types of food and drinks that fuels your creativity.
So I do the whole bulletproof coffee thing in the morning, something I picked up from friends. I try not to eat carbs for breakfast or lunch, just because I find that they slow me down. I mean, I'm Indian, so not eating carbs is damn near impossible. But I try to limit that. I try to eliminate them from my breakfast and my lunch. So that's food-wise, diet-wise.
Oh, wow. Amazing. But what types of food, I guess, like besides carb, like is there something... do you, if you're working from home, I wonder, like, do you make it a routine to kind of step out of the house and go to your favorite cafe or lunch spot, or do you make most of your meals?
No, I mean, I do make most of my meals, but, if I need to, I'll go to a cafe, but it's very rare.
Awesome. I'm taking notes, and I love to be able to practice how you lead your life. And I find it so refreshing to hear that, it's rooted in habits, because the way I see my quote unquote freedom for the past 10 years, it's only been during the weekends and, not even on vacation. That's when things become extremely chaotic. But, I feel like this morning, Monday, people asked me, how was my weekend? And I was like, I did too much. And I didn't really have enough time for myself. And coming back to work feels more exhausted than I felt on Friday. So I'd love to shift that to sort of the model that you had recommended. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, for me, it's all about habits.
Getting into speaking of habits, I feel like that's especially critical because even though I don't have a team, unlike Unmistakable Creative, to work on Feisworld podcast, you have a team of people you manage, and the team has really grown over the years. And you are now simultaneously writing a book, and I know. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Unmistakable is probably like a weekly show. I do see a lot of updates coming through.
Yeah, it's twice a week.
Oh my God, it's twice a week now. Wow. Yeah. How do you manage that? I mean, that's insane amount of work for people who don't do this line. Don't understand what goes into all the production and the shorts. Like, how do you balance all these tracks?
I don't know. I don't know necessarily think I really think about it as balance because I don't think of it as that much work. I mean, it's just it's. I think the idea of time management and balance. Like I think we all think we're busier than we really are, but really what we're doing is just wasting insane amounts of time on Facebook and screwing around online. I think that actually tends to be the case more often than not. So I don't know. I don't necessarily think of it as balance. I mean, I think part of it is I'm just deliberate about how I spend my time. And most of us are not deliberate about how we spend our time. We kind of just live in sort of a reactionary workflow, like other people dictate what we do. And so I don't let other people dictate the course of my day.
How much creative supervision or direction do you apply to, for instance, Unmistakable Creative podcast? After you record the conversation, what is that sort of post-production process like for you and your team?
It's fairly straightforward. I mean, I think one of the myths is that all that is edited, but I mean that's actually how the conversations come out. We don't do a lot of editing. One, because that kind of editing that you hear in sort of a startup or This American Life podcast is extremely expensive and time consuming. You need skilled producers, and we're sound editors, not audio producers. And so it's not particularly crazy. I mean, it's going through listening for sound bites that are worthy of turning into show notes and stuff like that. And we'll be changing our show notes format up pretty drastically because we realize show notes are pretty worthless. So we want to basically make the show notes more useful, which will be more of a profile of each person. Like read this stuff that this person has created, watch them give this TED talk, whatever it might be. So that's really, I think, what is, it's not, like I said, it's not particularly exciting or interesting.
It's funny that you mentioned show notes, I think, because I also released a new episode this morning, and last night I was just thinking, wait, I use SumoMe and I have all the plugins, the heat maps, and realizing that I put in so much time into taking show notes and the minute marks and all that, and nobody's reading, nobody's even looking at them, and so I began to change my format as well. So I'm curious to see how it works out because you have a much bigger, larger audience, and I wonder how people is going to respond to that.
I mean, part of it is experimentation, like seeing how people are going to respond. I mean, what we know is people listen to the show. I don't think they read the show notes. And, I mean, we're always willing to experiment and try things that are new and try things that are different.
How has the animated shorts been working out? And I saw that it was also broadcasted on Soul Pancake. It's phenomenal, like I think over 1.6 million subscribers that they have.
Yeah. It's been phenomenal. I mean, it's been a very challenging project because it's incredibly time consuming, but I mean, it's been really one of those things that I think has sort of raised the capabilities of our brand and showed people that, wait a minute, these guys do a lot more than just build up, create a podcast.
And I think also on top of that, it creates, I think you attract all of a sudden a completely different cohort. And as a result, people are thinking, okay, let's find out what else is Unmistakable Creative doing, what else is Srini doing, and then there's kind of the cross-pollination happening. And personally, I feel like I've been like extremely impressed by the shorts because beginning of this year, I guess, I interviewed a Disney producer, Christina Reed, who basically was the lead producer on Big Hero 6, Paperman, and she talks about, sort of the budget and the labor that go into these endeavors, which is incredible. So looking at the animations, I wonder is there any like sort of behind the scenes tips and tricks that you've come across, the software you use and how to, have you, because right now I've seen like at least 4 or 5 so far. Do you think that process has improved?
Well, so I guess, it's probably worth noting that we weren't the animators, right? We were the producers of the series. So I think that is not a question that I can really answer in much detail because we weren't the ones who animated it. I mean, we were the ones who chose the audio, but we worked with a team of multiple people. There's the entire Soul Pancake team, animators, an audio engineer. So it's not exactly, it's not as straightforward. Like, because we ourselves weren't the animators. I don't think it's something I can really answer.
That's okay. I wasn't sure, so I should have set up that question a little bit simpler than that. But in terms of the impact, people are certainly responding to that. I start reading the comments. But do you think, like, in terms of impact, has met your expectation, or what was your expectation going into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, like, the real goal was to create something that, we hoped people would love, that was just kind of beyond sort of the standard podcast and overlaying audio on a bunch of slides on YouTube, because that isn't what YouTube is for. It's a visual medium. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think we absolutely accomplished the goal. I mean, I think people really kind of saw it. And, like I said, I think it kind of altered our brand perception and raised the value of our brand.
And I think it's completely on brand too, because
sure.
comics, cartoon, animation has always been unique, to me, a very unique differentiator for Unmistakable. And, going into when you first established Unmistakable, was it your idea to kind of say, looking at the sea of sameness, look at all the podcasts, mostly it's a headshot or, it's an image, big fonts, but all of a sudden you're using, basically hand-sketched, comics, and it's just so fascinating, and it's totally different when you pull out the podcast. Like, how did you brainstorm that and or come up with the idea?
It was actually the byproduct of a 30-day project where I was teaching myself how to draw, and I was just kind of, screwing around, and and I wasn't, I was just, documenting it on Instagram, and I knew that I couldn't draw very well, but I realized that other people could. And so I asked, somebody if they'd be willing to illustrate something for the podcast. And what ended up happening was one of those album covers came back, and we looked at it and we're like, oh my God. And so in the rebranding process from, what was the Blogcast FM brand to what became Unmistakable, we ended up, coming up with that entire concept, and it kind of infused the entire brand. I mean, in addition to that, visuals played a big role in our brand, largely because of that 30-day drawing project.
Who knew? My goodness, I don't think I have read that anywhere in the book just yet, but that's very eye-opening, like how a 30-day project turned into the theme and the branding of your platform. Speaking of your platform, I noticed something very different with the way that you conduct interviews. And something I don't think I can ever get there, but I realized that you could probably tell from my voices, I get really excited, I get really worked up, and I jump in. But somehow, doesn't matter who you interview, I feel like your voice, your emotions are very even. Like whether it's Seth Godin or somebody we've never heard of before. Is that done on purpose, or I guess a better question would be how do you prepare for your interview going into it?
Well, I think that I don't really view it as sort of an interview or some sort of interrogation, I guess, because I feel like a lot of interviews come across as interrogations, whereas I kind of just see it as me sitting down in a coffee shop with somebody and having a conversation. But I've also had a lot of practice, right? Like I've done 600 of these, and then the other thing is that I actually go back and I listen to every single interview that I've done multiple times. Like that's why I still edit my own interviews. It's not efficient, but the thing I realized is as a byproduct of editing my own interviews, I think I have an unusual level of insight into that entire process and how it all goes together. So that I think is really what is the big thing that makes it all possible, is that it's been a lot of practice as well as a bunch of other stuff. I mean, again, it's years of work and then iterating and working through each one and learning from each one and looking at what I could do differently each time. So I don't know that I can necessarily boil it down into a formula for you.
When I talked to Krista Tibbett recently, and she said, Faye, there's something that's great about getting older and doing something longer. You do get better at it. So, so I was wondering in terms of the format, I couldn't quite, just by listening to the podcast, I couldn't guess whether you were in person or on Skype or elsewhere.
They're almost all by Skype.
Wow.
But I think that I have an ability to intuitively sense where a conversation is going. It just, again, I think part of it is it's been refined through years of practice.
What are some of the things that you, in terms of techniques or, shifting, I think just coming from a podcaster's perspective, exactly like you mentioned, I notice the things, the mistakes I tend to make myself and trying to kind of note down, but then all of a sudden you interview another person and their style is completely different. And what are some of the tips that you could give to a podcaster like myself?
Part of it is knowing your subject really well. I mean, so this is a double-edged sword, right? I don't do a lot of research on my guests, but then I find that when people don't do a lot of research, a lot of them end up sounding like they don't know what the hell they're talking about. which, you end up wasting somebody's time when you do that, which is frustrating to a lot of people. But that's one. But I think the bigger one is really, this is hard. So I don't script any of my questions. I think learning how to be a really good listener, that is probably the most critical thing that anybody as an interviewer has to learn how to do. And they have to realize that the interview is not about about them, but the person that they're interviewing. And the goal is to, shine a spotlight on them and bring out as much as you can out of them. And then I think the other big one for me is I'm constantly looking for, how do I get something out of this person that they've never talked about before? And so that's, I realize that that's not a lot to work with, but it's kind of hard to, if you've heard the podcast, I always say you get a compass, not a map, and I don't know how to extract the idea of how to conduct an interview.
I think it's, as you mentioned, when you were talking to Seth Godin, you said, he's not really teaching us how to live, but really teaching us how to think.
Yeah.
And how to approach certain questions and people and situations. And what I thought was interesting is you said, so you don't do a ton of research up front, but yet you want to cover things that a guest has never talked about before. So how do you find a middle there? I think that probably requires extensive research on things the person, does talk about a lot.
Yes and no. I mean, it's, the thing is, like, their work to some degree, but you also, like, I know the stories that people have told, right? So I kind of have an idea of what kinds of work that they're doing, but that's part of why I don't do any research is I know how to get there basically by probing. Like I treat it as a therapy session almost with this person. So I mean, I dig deep. Like I don't let people get away with surface level answers.
What are some of the questions that when people approach you about Unmistakable Creative, there must be some very common questions that people tend to ask, but what are some of the better questions you feel like people could ask but haven't yet? What are the real juices beneath of, kind of everything that you're doing that you really wish to trigger that what's deep inside?
I think that, really understanding, how do you make things unmistakable? What does this process look like for how you guys put such a consistent, quality of brand work into the world? Tara Gentili recently interviewed me for the Creative Live podcast, and I think she asked some of the best questions I've ever been asked. She basically said, she had me walk through, how did you arrive at getting to this point of something so consistent? How do other people do it? And I think that the other thing that's, for me, interesting is when people start to ask about, sort of inflection points and the various influences in your life and the people and people who shaped sort of your perspective on things. Because I think that's always really powerful when somebody can share those things with you. That's, like there's so many places you could go. And I feel like often we don't get people asking us a lot of things that actually lead to sort of deeper, richer conversations.
What do you do, speaking of diving deeper, what do you do when you sort of experience that creative block? To churning new content, to constantly interviewing and writing is extremely exhausting at the mental and physical level.
Well, surfing is a big one. I think that in general, like I think one of the best things anybody can do for their creative work is to basically unplug for like an hour a day, just shut everything down. You need time to think because then there's so many inputs coming at you. You just don't have room to think. Like you're just kind of digesting information endlessly, and that really is bad for you on so many levels.
In terms of creativity and all the work that we put in, one theme that I feel like you have mentioned through several episodes is to be able to, face your work again and just to show up and, truly believe in the process. So having done this for years, and this is something Jonathan Fields also talks about is like, what is that predictable success? And so how do you, go about creating, how do you go about creating a content calendar for yourself, for your podcast? And, who do you go and have the next conversation? What is, I try not to call it a formula, but, what is that process like?
Yeah, so I think, what you're talking about is creative output versus, just process. So our content calendar has always been the same. It's just about consistency, right? We know Mondays and Wednesdays we air episodes and Sunday we do a newsletter. all the rest of the days we're basically promoting our content or writing stuff. So that's really that. But in terms of the guest selection process, I mean, it's really driven entirely by curiosity, and that is really hard to boil down into sort of a set, formula of, okay, this is how you make me curious. So I mean, I'm always looking for things that most people wouldn't look for. Like I look for guests that most people wouldn't think to interview. I try to get people that you typically don't find on other shows, and I've prided myself on that. In fact, I go out of my way to do that because I just don't want to contribute to sort of an echo chamber.
What are some of the triggers for you to say, oh my God, do you go to an art show? Do you watch a movie and think like, well, that was amazing? Like, what are some of the trigger points you've identified to say, I really want to talk to that person? I mean, I'm going to follow up with him or her.
I think really what it is that if their work is really distinctive in some way, I mean, think about the amount of stuff that you're exposed to on a daily basis, and then think about the stuff that really stands out, right? Mm-hmm. It's a small percentage that just says, okay, wait a minute, after all the things I saw today, this really got my attention. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm always looking for is, okay, wait a minute, this was really different. This was really powerful. This impacted me emotionally. And those are the kinds of things that I think really are what draw me to, being interviewed by somebody or interviewing somebody, sorry.
It's so interesting to listen to that, not only as just a podcast listener, but someone who kind of also handles a lot of the same similar process. One of the questions I tend to want to know from other people's experience is dealing with rejections or dealing with no's or silence is, James told me that it takes him about 20 tries to get a yes from, one of his guests, the people you want to interview. So what is that? Well, I don't want to call it a success rate, but what in terms of the response rate have you noticed for Unmistakable?
So I don't get the 20 tries thing, but that's probably because I'm not as patient or persistent as James when it comes to that. I do, I still get turned down. People think that I don't get turned down just because, we've built this podcast. I mean, and a lot of it is timing. A lot of it is, hey, this isn't the right time. Check back with me in 5 months. I'll give you an example. Like we had Derek Sivers, and every time I asked him, he said no. And then out of the blue, he emailed me back and said, hey, if you're ready, I'd like to do the interview. And so we did. So, it was about, saying, okay, like when somebody says, email me back in 6 months, I actually have a note on my calendar to do it. Whereas most people don't do that. That's what I think really keeps them. So I think my success rate is pretty high in terms of getting people. But I also, again, I'm not trying to get, like President Obama on my podcast.
Yeah, definitely. So I think some level of follow-up maybe is necessary because a lot of these people do, have really huge endeavors and they're doing multiple things. And I think podcast does take away time from them. So do you remember the time, or was it over a period of time that you look back or you look at the state of Unmistakable Creative as a platform to say, wow, this is really a thing now. I can see myself do this for years until I don't enjoy it anymore. When was that and what was it like, that moment?
I think that really is something that continually has happened. It's been an evolutionary process, right? Like there are moments when you didn't think, and all that, like it was going to succeed. And then there were moments when, we're on top of the world. But I think, when the self-published book came out and was successful, that really was one of those, moments that I think I realized, okay, wait a minute, there's a career here. And then, obviously, getting a book deal with a publisher, those are certain moments. So you have these tipping points, right? But the thing is that you have to do all the work in between. It's not just that these points happen. Like there's so much work that happens in between. And a lot of that is very monotonous and unglamorous and ugly at times. And you have to wrestle with self-doubt and all the things that any creative project requires.
Do you compare yourself with, the reason for me to ask this is like I feel like it's hard for me to compare Unmistakable Creative with another group of podcasts. I feel like it's kind of in its own spot, kind of in its own league in a sense. Do you feel the same way?
So I guess it would be really arrogant to say yes, but yeah, I mean, I think I do. And that's been entirely by design. That's not, that's not unintentional. It's not an accident. And that's really, I mean, so much of what our work is about is to, get into a place where you're in your own league, where you're not compared, where your competition becomes irrelevant. Like, we're not looking at competition. We're not looking at what other podcasters do. This is another thing. I was just thinking about this other day, and I kind of want to pose this question on the Podcast Movement Forum and say, hey, if your entire audience is other people who have podcasts, are you really reaching an audience? that's a question worth asking. What are you hoping to accomplish with the podcast?
With my podcast?
Yes.
I feel like it's that magical space for me. By the way, I'm 32, and I think you wrote about kind of like it's around similar age and time, and just kind of realize, wow, life is more than this, and what can I do with my one life? And that's the trigger point for me. And I feel like I'm in a unique position as well, as in, being actually a little bit different, as I did grow up in Beijing. And on my most recent podcast, I said, well, this is Feisworld is a collection of personal mentors from Beijing to Boston. That's exactly almost 7,000 miles, and people I've come across and I've approached, and it's just unbelievable. And with the digital age, I think the beauty is, just like the conversation that we have now, like we have never met. And I really hope to be able to meet you one day, and I think it's be able to share success stories that other people might not have heard before. But it's so reachable. I mean, the people on my show, in Boston are creative directors, doctors, authors, and have done very well for themselves, but yet that people you feel like you could aspire to become one day, So that's really it. To close the podcast, and you've given very, very super thoughtful and very precise answers, which just shows how experienced you are. I guess my last question would be, what's next for you, and what's next for Unmistakable?
Mainly right now, I think the big priority is getting a book out. And then, of course, I have a second book coming after that because it was a 2-book deal. So those are kind of my 2 big projects at the moment.
Wow. What is the second book about?
It's going to be called 1,000 Words a Day, like the entire process of writing process and creative habits.
I will start practicing.
Yeah, that's always that's the way it starts.
Yeah. I personally feel like Unmistakable Creative hasn't had the sort of just the waves of people and, they are listening to it consistently in my world, which I find surprising because I work in creative. But if I look on Facebook and, Twitter, everywhere else, they're certainly there. In terms of the following and the sort of the social impacts and all of that, like what is your vision? Do you want it to be a more intimate environment, or do you...
Well, I mean, I think, we'd be lying to you if we didn't tell you we wanted it to get really big. I mean, my goal is to reach 1 million people. I want to have 1 million people listening to the show. We'd like to be on par with TED in terms of the audience we reach and the impact that we're having.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Srini, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
To listen to more episodes of the Feisworld podcast, please subscribe on iTunes or visit feisworld.com. That is FEISWORLD, where you can find show notes, links, other tools, and resources. You can also follow me on Twitter at Feisworld. Until next time, thanks for listening.